Good morning, dolls, and welcome to Little Gretchen's workshop. So these little pots and pans I made in a previous video, and I will leave a link in the description. But today we're going to fill them with food. Now this was a little can that I made with some aluminum pans, and I did show how I made those in that video as well. Now if you notice, the cans are partially filled with hot glue so that I won't have to use up all my polymer clay food and resin to fill them. So let's get started. Now the majority of the polymer clay food that I'm going to use in this video are scraps and remnants from previous food creation projects. So anytime you have random scraps and remnants from previous food creations, don't throw them away, save them. Now the majority of these things are scraps and remnants, but I do have a few pre-made fruits and vegetables that can be used as accents. Now that I have all my empty pots and a few scraps, let's go ahead and get started. Now a portion of this video is going to be dedicated to our harvest series where I made all the fruits and vegetables for the dolls to do their canning for the season. So I will be using those little dollar store glass jars. So I made several little stock pots, or I call them stewing pots or Dutch oven pots, that I want to fill, but I've got a couple large remnant pieces from some previous projects that I can use to fill up some of the space so I don't have to use up all of my new fruits and vegetables to create the look that I'm going for. Now dolls, these remnant pieces were from previous projects, so if you don't have any pre-baked remnants, you can use buttons or glue in anything solid to fill up the space. Now to be quite honest, in this video, dolls, I wasn't working in any particular order. I was actually just playing, and I'm going to allow you to watch. So I had several different colored peppers that I had already created from clay and pre-baked them, and I'm adding them one by one to the glass jars. And I made enough peppers to do at least 3 jars, and you can see here in this frame that the pieces aren't perfect, but I focused on making the colors and the shapes recognizable. But I think after adding coloring to the resin, it'll be very believable. So your pieces don't have to be perfect to give an amusing illusion. Now that I've filled the pepper jars, let me gather together the ingredients for my little stews. Now I had several little pieces that I'm picking out of my bags of remnants. Some pieces look like carrots, some look like potatoes. Then I've got some pieces that look like leaves or cabbage. And again, I'm just playing around, dolls. So in the midst of this, don't take it too seriously. Allow your imagination to be free. Take this opportunity to explore to see what you can come up with. And I'm sure whatever you create, your dolls will be happy to serve. And you can perfect things the next time around. But if you focus too much on perfection the first time around, you can truly stifle your creativity. Now, if you were working on a project where the items were very defined, you may need to take more time with them. But you have to keep in mind when you're creating one pot or single pot meals, most of the time the majority of the ingredients are indistinguishable. Now I've got some little yellow pieces that could be squash, some brown pieces that could be meat. So the pots with all the different shades of green are going to be cabbage. And then this multicolored stack is going to be a nice beef stew. Now you see I have the main pieces to the stews, but I'm breaking up some smaller pieces because you don't want everything to look too perfect and uniform. Now in the midst of going through all my remnants and little pieces of food, I found something that looked like candied carrots or candied sweet potatoes, but I'm not quite sure at this point if I'm going to use it. But it might come in handy filling that last empty pan. Now in this little plastic container, I have a mixture of cookies and buttons. Now they probably shouldn't be mixed together, cookies and buttons, but because they were all round, I stashed them all together in the same container. So now I'm sorting through them to pull out all the buttons because they were made with translucent clay, and to me that looks like onions. So as I sort the onions, I'm breaking some of them up into the other pots. So again, when you're making mixed pots of food, everything doesn't need to be distinctive. Now another thing that's good for filling jars or creating doll food is tiny beads, because in the right container they look like cherries or berries. Now I did make a little collection of peas and carrots. Now the peas are just rolled up green pieces of clay, and the carrots are a skinny that I cut into several little chunks. Now this can is partially filled with hot glue, so I don't use all my peas and carrots in one container. All these wonderful little jars came from the local dollar store, and they're just right for dolls to use for canning. Now I do have a few that are smaller. I'm not sure where I got them. That one is broken. Now I do remove the cork to fill them, but I will show you what I do with the cork in the end. Now although you want to put a nice amount of the peas and carrots inside the jar, you don't want to fill it because you want to leave room for the resin. Now these are some of the pots and skillets I made in the previous video, and I won't be filling them. I'm going to be using them for display only. So I'm going to set them aside. Now I'm going to be using UV resin inside my jars, but I do like to add some type of coloring or pigment to the imaginary fluid to give the contents a little bit more realism. Now these are resin pigments or alcohol ink that my daughter ordered for me off of Temu. It's no particular brand, but you can use a lot of things to color your resin, like food coloring. And another thing to keep in mind, in miniature, a little bit goes a long way. So dolls, it is a best practice to add the coloring to the resin and then slowly add it to the jar. But being the miniature rebel that I am, I added the clear resin directly to the jar. Then I added the coloring and the beads and stirred it until I had an unnecessary amount of bubbles. Always remember to wear nitrile gloves on each hand when working with resin. Now to cure my resin creations, I just use an UV light that's normally used for curing nail art and designs. And it's really nice because you can get a lot of miniatures in there to cure at one time. And it's really a good practice to layer it. So to add resin, add food, add some more resin, and then more food. Now here I'm squeezing the resin directly into the jar, really risking overfilling it. Be really careful trying not to overfill it because it makes it difficult to arrange things without it running over, because I generally try to arrange things a little bit with the toothpick before I cure it. Now dolls, these red berries or cherries are actually made with polymer clay. I did throw in a couple grapes as well, pretending that it's some type of vintage fruit cocktail type thing. So I'm just playing around, dolls, and adding a few in just like I did when I was doing the berries that were made with seed beads. And after I got a nice amount in, I tried to arrange it with my toothpick. And this is how they look before I added any coloring to the fluid. Now you see I have red pigment and yellow pigment. So the yellow pigment I'm adding to my peppers to give the impression of some type of pickling juice or spices. So I'm adding little bits of the coloring with a toothpick to the inside of the jar. And now I'm pouring the remainder in. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, a little bit goes a long way. And I say that as a reminder to myself because I have a tendency to be a little bit of an overuser. And as you can see here in this frame, I'm squeezing out more of the pigment into the jar of peppers because I felt like it wasn't dark enough. Now that I've added some more color to the fluid, I'm adding a little bit more resin to fill the jar up. Now this is the brand I'm using. It's no particular brand. I got it off of Amazon. I've used this up, and so now I'm going to use this brand. They both cure really well with my nail light, so that's what I use. So now that the glass jars are pretty much set, I went on to add resin on top of the hot glue of the metal cans I created. And then I put in my peas and carrots and then added 1 drop of resin to the top to cover everything up. Now I did take a moment to use my toothpick to coat everything and make sure all of the peas and carrots were covered in the resin. And after you feel like you've got a nice amount of vegetables, peas, carrots, whatever you have in your can, go ahead and make your final arrangements and then put it under the light to cure. So while the fruit and the peas were curing, I went on to turn my attention to the beef stew. Now I was really excited because I really felt like I had a nice amount of scraps to make something really believable. So I'm gluing in the clumps of fillers to the bottom of the stock pot pan, and now I'm arranging my loose pieces of vegetables and meat to camouflage the filler so that it looks like the entire pot is filled with stew. Now it may be a good idea to allow the glue to harden, and while the glue was hardening around the added vegetables, I added a few extras just for a little accent. And here's a last glance at my completed stew before I add the resin on top. So let me show you all my creations now that they've all been cured. So here are my cured jars, cans, and stews. Now I like to seal off my jars with the cork before I add the fabric to the top. So I just add a little bit of glue inside the lip of the jar and then push the cork down as far as I can and trim off the excess. And then I add a little bit more glue to the top of the cork so that it'll seal it off flat. And here I am again trimming off the cork after I've pushed it down as far as I can inside the top of the jar and adding a little glue to seal it off. So now that I've sealed it off with the cork and the glue, I'm adding a small piece of gingham fabric to the top. Now it will stick to the cork a little bit, which will give you a reasonable amount of control so that you can wrap it around the rim of the jar so you can seal it off with a tiny piece of thread. Now, it really works well if you add a little bit of glue to the thread, just so that when you're wrapping it, it will cling to the existing thread, and then allow it to dry. Now, I use several different types of fabric, kind of coordinating them with the colors of the contents. I really like the way the peaches and the green fabric look together. Now, I always want to encourage you to use what you have, and I did have several scraps and remnants, and I thought this was the perfect time to use them up in this lovely little project. Now, I want you dolls to keep in mind that this project took a lot longer than the length of this video. Take your time and do each part individually, and just make sure that when you're done, you have a project that you're proud to display. Now, if you enjoyed this video today and want to see more content like this, go ahead and subscribe. And always look for me on Mondays after 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time during the month of November and December 2024. I sure do enjoy creating these videos for you dolls, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on the next episode of Little Gretchen's Workshop. Bye-bye now, dolls.